Have you ever heard of a sundown town?
And they say, dude, you might want to get up out of here as soon as possible. We're at sundown. You want to leave here now.
Sundown towns are communities that systemically excluded African Americans and other minority groups, often through intimidation, restrictive housing policies, and even violence.
Have a little pride in the race, brother. White pride worldwide.
While many of these towns no longer explicitly enforce racial exclusion, as in there isn't a written law saying blacks get out, but some still exhibit stark racial disparities that reflect their history and current ideologies. If you were to guess where these so-called sundown towns are located, many people will conjure up a list of towns in Mississippi or Alabama. But while there are certainly sundown towns in the South, I'm talking about sundown towns that are more shockingly in the North. This non-South part of the US likes to think they are a bastion of inclusion, but many states would be shocked, or maybe not shocked, to find out that they contain some problematic towns. Let's start out with a city that has less than 1.5% of its population as African Americans, Kennewick, Washington. A Kennewick resident recently shared, "I've had elderly customers ranting about wanting to return to the good old days when businesses were all closed on Sunday and people who shouldn't be here knew to be gone by sunset." Yes, this is literally the attitude of today by actual residents in Washington. Kennewick, located in southeastern Washington, was a well-documented sundown town in the mid-20th century. During this period, black individuals were prohibited from remaining in the town after sunset. When the sun goes down, you can't be around. Can you even imagine someone telling you this? This exclusion was not merely a product of social intimidation, but was often enforced by local authorities who engaged in racial profiling and harassment. Reports from the time suggest that law enforcement would escort black individuals to the city limits, reinforcing the town's status as a hostile environment. The exclusion of African Americans from Kennewick continued through housing discrimination, with restrictive covenants preventing non-whites from purchasing or renting property. In the 1960s, the town was referred to as the Birmingham of Washington due to the treatment of black citizens, with less than 10 black residents living there in 1963. According to the 2020 census, the city demographics include only 1.5% of the entire population. The lingering racial imbalance is a testament to its exclusionary history, but the attitudes of today help reinforce it. A former resident shared, "I lived in Anna, Illinois for a brief period of time. It's still racist AF and gross. I left ASAP and will never go back." Anna, Illinois is a town that has a particularly infamous reputation as a sundown town. It is well known throughout the town and area that Anna has a chilling acronym. This town knowingly stands for Ain't No N-Word Allowed. A traveler through the town recently shared, "My coworker and I were traveling through Anna. While getting gas, my coworker was told Anna is an acronym for Ain't No N-Words Allowed. But he didn't say N-words. He went full hard R. My coworker is black and I am not. The dude then sat in his truck and waited until we left. It hasn't changed." If you didn't know and were just traveling through, I can't even imagine the shock of hearing that. But even more, the resident sharing that openly and condescendingly, and then waiting until the black person he shared it with left the town. Awful. This is present day, people. Anna's nickname stems back from the violent removal of black residents in the early 20th century. African Americans were driven out of Anna and neighboring Jonesboro in the 1900s, and the town even became known as an unwelcome place for black travelers. Even as the civil rights movement made progress in other parts of the country, Anna remained nearly all white. Today, the town has an overwhelmingly white population, with African Americans making up less than 1%. The continued racial disparity suggests that the legacy of its exclusionary past has not been fully dismantled, and black residents are still underrepresented in the community. Another Illinois resident shared, "Since 2016, it seems to have gotten worse, if that's possible." Edina, Minnesota is a very white suburb of Minneapolis. In speaking with a resident of Edina, she shared that Edina has been a poster child for rich white suburbs for a long time, and in many ways, it still 100% is. Another Adena resident posted publicly, "Adena is famous for blocking the development of affordable housing. They say, oh, Richfield is a great place for the poor and brown people." This shows how much Adena would like to say they've changed, but there is still significant change needed. Adena was a sundown town that used racial restrictive housing covenants to prevent African Americans from living in the town. One of the most notable examples of this discrimination was in the Country Club District, a planned community that explicitly prohibited non-white residents through legal contracts and actions. Even after racial covenants ended officially in 1948, the town still wrestled with racist attitudes, with real estate agents steering black families away from the area. The city remained largely homogeneous throughout the 20th century. Despite Minneapolis being a diverse metropolitan area, Adena's racial makeup has been slow to change. As of the 2020 census, non-Hispanic white residents make up approximately 77% of the population, while African Americans account for only about 4%. The stark racial disparity suggests that barriers, whether economic, social, or residual bias from its past, continue to shape Adena's demographics. While discussing racist towns in Connecticut, a person nominated Darien and a resident shared, "Darien used to be a sundown town. Kinda still is." Darien, Connecticut is a town that puts the sundown on more than just African Americans. The wealthy suburb of New York City was historically known for its exclusionary policies targeting both African Americans and even Jewish families. Real estate agents in Darien practiced racial steering, ensuring that homes were sold only to white buyers. Social intimidation reinforced these practices, and black individuals were largely absent from the town throughout much of the 20th century. Despite Connecticut's overall racial diversity, Darien remains overwhelmingly white. As of the 2020 census, non-Hispanic whites make up about 88% of the population, while African Americans constitutes less than 1%. The town's exclusivity, combined with high property values and social barriers, continues to reflect its history as a sundown town. A former resident of Levittown, Pennsylvania shared, "I grew up in Levittown. Best thing I ever did for myself was leave. Casual racism," and then goes on to list several other issues with the town. Another former resident said, "Levittown, more like leaving town. I will never be back." Levittown is one of the most famous planned communities of the 1950s, built as a suburban enclave for white middle-class families. When the first black family moved into Levittown in 1957, they were met with widespread hostility, protest, and even violence from white residents. Housing policies originally barred black residents from purchasing homes, reinforcing racial segregation. Although those explicit policies were eventually overturned, the demographic impact remains. As of the 2020 census, non-Hispanic whites makes up about 88% of the population, while African Americans constitute only about 3%. Levittown's history as a sundown town continues to shape its racial makeup today. Clutch your pearls, liberal California, because you are not exempt from this list. Hawthorne, California is a city in the Los Angeles metropolitan area that was a notorious sundown town during the mid-20th century. It was once described as the most beautiful suburban town and a city of good neighbors, which is shocking considering the implications of those titles. Racial covenants and law enforcement practices ensured that African Americans and other minority groups were unwelcome. Redlining further reinforced segregation, preventing black families from purchasing homes. Although Hawthorne has become more diverse over time, the legacy of its sundown policies is still felt in socioeconomic disparities. The city's black population remains lower than that of other nearby communities, reflecting the lasting effects of decades of exclusion. You can't get much further north than Maine. In the early 20th century, Milo, Maine was a focal point of Ku Klux Klan activity, most notably by playing host to the KKK's first daylight parade in the United States in 1923. Not only was it the first time the KKK did a parade in the daytime, Milo was the first KKK parade in the Northeast. In recent years, Maine has undertaken various initiatives to combat racism and promote inclusivity. Statewide efforts include the Maine Human Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and other factors in areas such as employment, housing, and education. Organizations like Anti-Racism Organizing in Maine, AROM, have also been founded, focusing on building anti-racist communities through education and policy advocacy. These broader state initiatives reflect a commitment to addressing historical injustices and fostering a more equitable society. Way to go, Maine! Goshen, Indiana has a history of racial exclusion dating back to the early 20th century. Historical accounts suggest that Black individuals faced aggressive efforts to keep them out, including law enforcement warnings to leave town before nightfall. Some oral histories indicate that Goshen's sundown status was enforced through threats of violence. Though the city has gradually diversified in recent years, its racial composition still reflects its past. A former resident shared, "I never felt at home in Goshen. I was treated differently for the color of my skin, and my safety was always in jeopardy. I had to leave and will never be back." As of the 2020 census, non-Hispanic whites comprise approximately 74% of the population, while African Americans make up only about 2%. These numbers highlight the lingering effects of the town's sundown policies, where exclusionary practices, whether economic or social, continue to shape the town's demographics. In 2023, a documentary called Goshen, A Sundown Town's Transformation, was made to highlight the town's past as well as efforts to improve. Vienna, Illinois is located in the county seat of Johnson County. This town remained a sundown town well into the 20th century. African Americans were explicitly barred from residing in the town, and those who attempted to stay were met with violence and intimidation. Sound familiar? Oral histories recount stories of Black travelers being warned to leave before sunset, a practice that was widespread and accepted in many small southern Illinois towns. Though legal segregation ended decades ago, Vienna's demographics remain starkly unbalanced. As of the 2020 census, non-Hispanic whites make up about 90% of the population, while African Americans constitute approximately 8%. While this marks a slight increase in diversity, Vienna remains largely homogeneous compared to the state as a whole, and even more jarring when compared to cities like Chicago. No one would think to put Chicago on this list, but there is a suburb of Chicago that makes this list. Cicero, Illinois is infamous for its history of racial hostility. In the 1950s, an African-American family attempting to move into Cicero faced violent mobs, leading to the 1951 Cicero race riot. On the evening of July 11, 1951, one of the biggest riots in U.S. history began after a young Black couple moved into an apartment in all-white Cicero, Illinois, west of Chicago. The town remained almost entirely white for decades, with Black families being discouraged from settling there through intimidation and real estate discrimination. While Cicero's demographic has shifted to a predominantly Hispanic population, African Americans still make up only a small fraction of this community. This enduring exclusion suggests that the town's sundown history has had a lasting impact. While there are no known written laws excluding any particular race for things, it's clear that the past is still in the present with mindsets and attitudes. What do you think the change needs to be in order to have a more productive future? Like, subscribe, and check out this video on cities that Black Americans are fleeing.